All right. Everything
Welcome,
should be good.
everyone, to our panel about preserving sound in computers and consoles. My name is Chris. I run a YouTube channel called Displaced Gamers. And joining me today, we have YouTubers Corey and Try from My Life in Gaming, as
Hi.
well as, I'm gonna do this right, man, creator of the 240p test suite, the Imagineer behind the MD Fourier project, and the godfather of awesomeness, Artemio.
Hey, nice to meet you. That was too much, Chris. Thank you.
So
It's never too much when it comes to Artemio.
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. So,
He's
well, thank you for
simultaneously like,
joining me, guys. So when I talk about preserving sound, this is a topic that I don't feel people really ever talk about. When I talk about preserving sound, what do I mean? Why is it important for us to preserve the sounds of these old video games that people play just for fun and then move on with their lives? Why do we need to do something about preserving sound?
Well, I think that the main question would be why would we need to preserve games? And from there, why wouldn't we need to preserve a part of those games with more precision? And I'd say that first and foremost, they are important artifacts for people out there, and they are cultural artifacts that represent a part of our history, and they also can be very valuable resources in the future for investigations that you can't even imagine. For example, if you have an arcade PCB and you reach out to it, you can figure out if, I don't know, Capcom and SNK were working together at that time, if they had relationships with Philippines or with Thailand to build those components, if there was an economical or political reason for that happening, that could sustain that evidence. And that's just from the hardware itself, and there's so much culture around every one of these objects, and sound is at least half of the experience when you're in front of a game playing it, right? So why not pay more attention to that? That would be my question.
Yeah, and it seems to me that sound has been harder to get right in emulated form than simply replicating the visuals in a way where, there aren't obvious visual glitches and things like that. I mean, there are certain platforms that, like Sega Genesis and PC Engine, that in particular are kind of infamous for whatever reason, the information of how the console works, which I don't know a lot about, but the information of that is not translated quite as clean into emulation oftentimes, I think.
yeah.
I feel that. Oh, go ahead, Corey.
I mean, and a lot of people will say that the audio is more subjective. I like there's a lot of audiophiles will say audio is more subjective, and it changes from person to person. But until recently, it was very difficult to really nail down a way to get hard data on audio. I mean,
I think that first and foremost, the issue is that you can see the discrete colors on screen and judge them with a, I don't know, a capture card. But yes, it may be an issue to get that properly calibrated and you're getting the levels right. There's a kind of warrants there, yes. But you can kind of, at least relatively between themselves, check out each pixel and check the colors that you're getting, right? Of course, that's a huge issue because it's analog video, and that won't translate as easily. But I'm simplifying here. I'm just saying how it works as exposed to the user. You can see, or you can tell that the colors and the pixels are on screen, and it's self-evident because they are discrete elements that are split by the image itself. And when you're talking about audio, it's rarely a single tone that you're hearing. You are hearing a composition between the sum of a lot of sound effects, the music, and many of them could be played back directly like samples, or others could be produced live, and that makes it difficult, I think.
Visually, we can put two things next to each other and someone can judge, say which one they like better. You can do that with sound to a certain extent, but sometimes people are unaware that there's a difference. They don't notice it, or maybe they notice it on a subconscious level, right?
Yeah.
So
And
it's one of those things where if you're playing a game and the sound is muted, you might say, well, where's the sound? And as soon as somebody gives you the sound, you just say, well, okay, and you move on with it.
mhm.
Yet, if you take the same person and you were to have them play the same game with two different types of sound hardware, it could very well be that they said, oh, I appreciated the first way I played the game versus the second way I played the game. And it could be that the only variable there was the sound, and they're unaware of it because it's reached
Also,
them on a bit of a subconscious level.
Mm.
supporting what you just said, Chris, I was just last night playing Is 9, and I have been playing it with the volume lower during the last week. And when I played with the volume higher, it affected how I experienced it. And it's a very common and well-known situation that volume or amplitude affects our perception of which we prefer, right?
Yeah, especially in a series like Ease, where the music is integral to the experience.
Yeah, and you know, I knew people back in the day, and I'm sure there's still a lot of people that are like this now, um, where you know they would either turn the game volume all the way down or turn the music all the way down if they had that option, and they would like you know have another TV next to them where they were like watching something on TV while they were playing the game. The audio to the game was not that important to them,
Right.
although I kind of wonder if they had the audio on, maybe it would be more meaningful to their experience with the game than they think it would be. But I think for a lot of people, not people in this community certainly, but I think a lot of people um, for who it's maybe a little bit more of a disposable entertainment,
Mhm.
don't think about game audio. Period, if they even listen to it at all.
On that same line, maybe in many cases it's because one wants to get immersed or absorbed by the experience, and audio helps in that regard, right? If you're not looking for
Absolutely.
that, if you're just looking to pass time, it's less important.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
And one thing I've become acutely aware of over time is that as I get older, there's less. I hear less less frequencies in the music or in sound. You know, I've been called out on that several times with you know, if I shoot something and I have a CRT on in the background, I can't hear it. And then
Oh.
people are saying like, "Oh, what's that sound?" Every time you're on camera, I can hear this ringing in the sound. So now I have to use like a notch. I have to use like a notch filter so I could like you know take that specific frequency and just push it out.
But you know, speaking of the you know sort of the limits of your own perception, I think in regard to audio preservation and just preservation in general, I think it's important to sort of separate uh, what you perceive from what is actually there. Because I, for example, am profoundly musically inept. You know, if you it blew me away back in the day when you know if y'all are familiar with the Final Fantasy games, especially the earlier Final Fantasy games like on NES and Super Nintendo. And I apologize, I cannot sing. But there at the beginning of the battle theme in all of those games, it goes da na 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 da na da na 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 da na. And a friend went on piano and went one note 6 times, da na 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 na, and then 2 notes lower, da na, and then repeated that. Blew my mind that battle intro was 2 notes. Like those that whole first set of 6 notes could have been anywhere in my mind. I can hear it, I can recognize the tune, but I just have a very difficult time understanding uh you know just the flow of music. I can't read music. I'm very musically inept, but uh no matter what you perceive, I think getting to the the truth of what uh that music is, what that hardware is doing, it's important to do that on in a similar way to where someone might plug their PlayStation 2 into their HD TV and say, oh, there's zero lag here. And it's like, well, buddy, I'm sorry to tell you, but that game is 480i. You're on an HD TV. There is 100% for sure some degree of lag. You may not feel it, but you don't need to go on the internet telling people, oh, there is no lag, or, this emulated version of something is exactly the same as the original. It's exactly the same. People really like to use a lot of definitives based on their own perception and then spread that around. And we need to step back and be a little bit skeptical of what we are perceiving and use what tools we have to do things like detect input lag, detect color anomalies, and detect audio anomalies.
It's important what you're mentioning because it helps either way. Sometimes when you measure it and you say, I'm very sensitive to lag, and you measure it and then you notice, no, I'm not. It's a possibility. I'm not saying that that's a case, right? But I'm very sensitive to colors, and you measure it and you notice, no, I'm not, just like you said with those notes. And the same could happen with audio, or it could be the other way. Once you train yourself, you notice that you start figuring out which things are off if you understand them, if you put names into them. It's like the colors, right? You've all heard probably that colors only exist in the cultures when we name them. I believe that's really true in many ways, because until you understand that's a bass line, that's a guitar, those are high frequencies, these are low frequencies, these are the mids, and you start like playing with a digital audio editor and remove or filter out each one and separate them, or just like taping over your tweeters or your cones and trying to understand how things are separated, and you name them, you can start understanding them.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an aside, but that reminded me about how I recently learned that in Japanese, there's kind of an overlap of what they consider blue and green. Like if you had an unripe banana, they'd look at it and be like, oh, it's kind of blue. Or like the traffic light would be like, oh, it's a blue light.
And you can flip it, and it could be that we are missing that experience.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the Super Nintendo real quick, because there's been a recent push to have these remastered soundtracks where people are going back to some of the original equipment and grabbing these sounds that have not been through the compression that you would hear them have when they're played back on a real Super Nintendo. What do you guys think about that?
I think it loses a lot of the texture to the music, and it's pretty neat, but I would not want it that way permanently.
Yeah.
It loses a lot of personality to it.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, we say that as people who grew up playing Super Nintendo. We are attached to how it sounds, and I could imagine maybe someone who is high school age today, if they were given a side by side of those, they would say, which do you prefer? And they'd say, oh well, this remastered version sounds cleaner.
Yeah.
They might prefer it, but it is inauthentic
Right.
to what that actual experience is. And I think it's important to remember that I doubt very few, if any, of the people who were composing for Super Nintendo games were thinking, oh, if only my masterpiece could sound exactly like this raw sample. No, they chose the sample because that sample sounded good coming out of the Super Nintendo.
That sounds a lot. Sounds a lot like somebody saying that they used composite to create their images.
Well, and which is true. I mean, it is very obvious on the Sega Genesis that some artists did use composite video characteristics cleverly. But like I always say, I think anyone who worked on these old games, I have such a hard time believing that very many of them are such stuck-up artists that if you were not playing it on a CRT in composite or RF video, they would be like, that's really not, that's not really how you should be playing it. It doesn't look right, doesn't sound right. No, like 20, 30, 40 years after they made the darn thing, like if there's like people out there that still want to play it or listen to it or look at it, like they would be nothing more than grateful, just totally grateful that you were experiencing their work so much so much time after they made it.
Right.
There's also the thing that we can look at the past and think that that's like antiquated or obsolete, but it was top of the line at the moment, right?
Right.
And I bet that if they had RGB as an option, they would probably tune their things up there. And also with the samples taking it back, if they had more RAM on the SNES or more cartridge space, because that would have raised costs everywhere, they would have chose to do that. I think that it's interesting to listen to them on the sources, but they are certainly a different character, just like Corey said. What do you think, Chris?
Well, I got a little distracted because Troy mentioned the Sega Genesis, and I started thinking about how, well, thankfully we only have one model of the Sega Genesis, right? And they all sound the same, right? I mean, there's no other way. No, we have many models of the Sega Genesis and other devices that play Sega Genesis games. So what do we preserve? Which one's the right one? You talk about sound being subjective, right? I mean, not only do you have these different revisions of the console and the circuits for their output, but you literally have a change in Yamaha chips at some point.
Right.
So then, some people are going to get into, well, this composer used this sound chip, this composer used that sound chip, and they may select it based on that.
Right.
Artemio is holding up the definitive. Oh, that's your childhood Genesis, the Model 1, right?
Yeah.
Which is the definitive Sega Genesis of all time.
In this moment, yeah.
Certified.
So I suppose we should take this opportunity to explain that the work that Artemio is doing is in a utility or application called MD Fourier. Do you want to kind of explain to people in the chat like what exactly it is? Because I'm sure you're very good at just like summing it up very quickly at this point.
Well, basically, it's just a tool to try and help with an issue. Just as Troy was saying, it's very difficult to evaluate sound just at face value, right? So the idea is to split every part of the sound produced on a game system console or system in general, and make that run a series of tones to cover everything that it can reproduce and we can hear. Okay, it could be expanded either way, but that way you could just measure how it responds, how it behaves when it plays back those sounds from the whole spectrum, everything that could be produced and we can hear, and then just measure it back with math called a Fourier transform to compare between things. And it comes back to what Chris was saying about references, because the software is made in a way that you can choose any reference and any or target and any other source to compare them, and it gives you as output the difference visually on how they differ in the spectrum that you select.
So how did you discover how to like do this? I mean, Fourier is. I mean, he was was he a composer or a sound analyst? Like, I mean, he was a person, correct?
Yeah. Well, this guy was a genius, and he 200 years ago basically used or invented the process, although other people had already kind of played with it. But a way to decompose a signal. A signal is anything that you can record by measurements. Okay, so he was measuring temperature, and he was trying to figure out how temperature changed in his setup for something. Okay, and he developed this process to decompose a signal and how it behaves into its most essential parts. That is, we were talking about sound that you get a sum of the things. Everything, my voice right now, what you're hearing, is being played back by my mouth and my pharynx and everything, and it goes into this microphone. This microphone vibrates in the same way that the air my voice is pushing. It converts it to an electrical signal. The electrical signal vibrates in an analog way to what I'm saying, and that is being digitized, right? It's being sampled. But my voice is not a single tone. It's not vibrating in a sine wave that could be just like purely mathematical. It's a sum of how every one of my vocal cords, my teeth, my tongue, every vibration there is summed up. What the Fourier transform does is take that complex waveform and convert it into basic sine waves that could be represented with mathematical formulas. And how that helps is because if you simplify things that way, you can take out the ones that are not needed, for example, and not needed. I'm saying if it's composed by, I'll just throw a number, 5,000 waves. I take the top 5, compress those, and send them over the internet, and that's what you're hearing right now. I'm oversimplifying, but that's kind of what the Fourier transform is used for right now, for the video you're watching, the audio that you're listening to right now. So that process is what uh, I simply took and said, well, if we want to compare audio and want to have an objective way to compare how a particular note is being played by one console and another console, we can just decompose them into their essential notes and compare those. And if those add up, then we have the same thing. If those are different, then we have different things. That's kind of the basic idea. I hope I didn't go too much.
So basically, you take that sound data from a reference console like Artemio's childhood Sega Genesis Model 1,
But the
and you
reference is
take
arbitrary. Yeah.
Yes.
the reference is arbitrary, yes, but if you take something like, for example, it could be anything from an at games clone to a real Model 2 Sega Genesis to a Mega SG to a Mister to a software emulator, and you run those sounds, MD Fourier automatically compares the recordings, and you can see where the differences are, how certain uh, sound channels differ, and how broadly they differ, and you can use that to um, kind of inform your adjustments to making your replication more like the target sound. But I'm kind of a little bit from Analog Frontiers Part 3 here, but in his interview and that, Artemio said, I think that uh, preservation should be blind to preferences, and
Okay.
perhaps more so than perhaps audio more so than anything else, because the audio is, as we've said, wildly subjective, but you kind of have to take yourself out of that, because it's like, well, I know everyone prefers Genesis Model 1 sound, and of course not every single Model 1 Genesis sounds exactly the same, but we also need to have references for what all of these systems sound through the full range of what they can produce through MD Fourier. And just like I believe it was mentioned in the chat, uh, in Mister, for example, they have attempted to replicate the sample recordings from Artemio's Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And you can choose which of those audio profiles you want, because if you can't just say like, oh, only the Model 1 is worth preserving. No, I mean, we need to know what many possible options sounded like.
I think gaming culture often tries to force everyone into having a consensus and agree on
Yeah.
Oh boy, yeah.
something. And so I feel that choice, accurate research, and choice is the best way to go, because it's an individual based decision. It shouldn't be a decision made as a group. So if I'm looking at the My Life in Gaming guys right now, and I'm like, guys, I'm gonna go play a game on my Genesis. I'm gonna use this right here to get my AV. Then hopefully you guys wouldn't be traumatized by that.
No.
But yeah, but it's all about choice and finding ways to, in the case of sound, use the MD Fourier project as a tool to help replicate that accuracy of all these different consoles and be able to present that choice.
And I think it is important to remember, Artemio consistently refers to it as a tool. He once explained it to me, just, it's just a tool like a hammer, and certainly you could use a hammer to, build the most beautiful house you've ever seen, or, a shack that, is going to fall apart in 2 weeks. And I do think that there is a danger. And again, with anything with preservation, you have to think beyond what you perceive yourself and critically evaluate, well, how was this used? Because any given project could claim, we use MD Fourier for our sound adjustments. And I think in many people's minds, that is kind of shorthand for like, oh, well, then it's the one to get. It's perfect. And that's not necessarily true. It just means that they used it. Maybe they used it and went, huh, and then did nothing. or maybe they actually did make some adjustments, but couldn't push it all the way. Don't assume just because MD Fourier was used. If you really want to know yourself how close it is, then you need to take a sample from the target that you want to hit, such as a Model 1 Genesis. I know we're talking Genesis a lot, but I do believe, if I'm not mistaken, that must be where the MD and MD Fourier came from. Even though it's
musical doctor. It's musical doctor.
Well, there you go. It's just the Mega Drive version was done first. I always assumed that was what it was for, but it is of course available for as a tool for many platforms. But if you really want to know, don't just accept as truth what someone said about their emulator or their FPGA core or their whatever. Don't just assume like, oh, they said it was used MD Fourier, then this is absolute 100% reference quality. No, if it is important to you, then you need to make your own analysis using MD Fourier, which you can download for yourself. And me, who was actually kind of afraid to use it for a long time, Artemio was like, I'm not a gatekeeper on this. Like, you don't have to send me the files. You can do it. You can run your own analysis. And I was like, okay, I'll try. And I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of fun. So you should absolutely do your own.
Right?
What's that?
Let's say what? I didn't hear that.
Oh, sorry, Try. Like, I was just saying, hey, why don't we look at some of those analysis that you have from some of the Sega Genesis consoles, if you have them available.
Yeah, Corey, I have a few, but I wanted to
screen a little larger once he has them up.
Yeah, but I wanted to mention beforehand that MD Fourier, just as Tri said, is not a solution for everything. It's just a tool. And we have many other things that we need to preserve sound. We need to have archives, recordings like the 16-bit preservation project, or you need to have the gameplay with the sound effects in good quality with a good audio card. We need to have a lot of stuff. We need also emulation. We need also simulation with FPGA open source implementations, because this is a constant process. Once you achieve something, you need to figure out how to push it through to the next generation of people that will be doing this, right? And they will need documentation. They will need open source tools. That's why MD Fourier is open source, attempting to do that, just as Mystery is and as MAME is. The spirit of all this is to get those that knowledge to the next generation and documentation. And at the same time, it's very important to keep the hardware working, because we don't know what we'll be able to pull off in like 50 years in analysis terms over those things. And that could be way more complete to what we have. So this is not like a silver bullet. It's just a tool, okay?
Yeah,
in the process.
and like you say, I'm starting. I started to lose my train of thought. I had a good thought, but now I kind of lost it. Anyway, go on. I'm sorry.
Well, you were talking about making recordings of these things and using them within D4EA. It's a really good reason for crowdsourcing to become
Right.
a large part of this. So right now, as I understand it, for instance, you don't have any recordings from a Pioneer Laser Active. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
that's correct.
So if somebody has a Laser Active and they would like to contribute, you can download the suite, play it via, if you have the Genesis pack in, via a cartridge or the CD version, make a recording, and it can be used for analysis. And that's very helpful. And it's true of many other devices besides just the Pioneer Laser Active.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to remember too that a lot of people may think, in the here and now, well, I don't really care about 100% accuracy. But the thing is, if we don't strive for compiling as absolutely accurate as possible data as we can to send forward into the future, then people will have a harder and harder time uh, approximating what it really is, what that true accurate source really is. So, accuracy is important because, uh, you know, presumably right now we are while we have the systems that still function, we're in the best position to provide that information for the future.
Yeah, that's right. I think that if we have the capability to do something, and that something could be very difficult in the future, we have every responsibility to do it now as a community, right now. And just as Tri said, we have MP4 running on many systems, and we need people to just develop on these systems if you're capable of, or just record, just like Chris said. But of course, there are some limitations. You need a good audio interface. We would love that any interface would be good enough, but not every interface is good enough to have like preservation quality recordings. But any interface is good enough to make your own measurements and compare, because that same interface will have the same flaws or virtues for any recordings that you make. So they are basically eliminated when you are comparing things captured with the same audio interface, even though if it's not a perfect one, right? So it doesn't like exclude you from making tests. And a good audio interface is not that expensive. They should be cheaper, but they are not that expensive nowadays.
And some capture cards, even if you're capturing in HDMI sources, I discovered, like mine, for example, I can actually open it as an audio source in an audio recording program and record a WAV file, which I was pretty pleased to see. But not every capture card offers that. It's like that HDMI source is a separate device.
We also have a test to test the equipment, so you could know how good it is in a very stringent way, because it's a very demanding test for audio equipment, and we have that also available if you are interested in that. And we of course measure your audio equipment before accepting submissions. Right? It's not that we are elitist or anything. We just need to have a baseline, right?
There was a interesting question from the chat from Chris Fratz was asking, here's an interesting thought on the topic of what should be preserved. Why not try to preserve how retro consoles sounded through various different setups? Like, for example, a VCR to an RF or composite.
A mono TV speaker. I mean, that's what I had growing up.
Yeah, of course, and that's completely possible. The thing is how you record it, because your recording equipment is the limitation. But VHS is perfectly doable in many ways. And it's one of the targets of the MD4E project, because it was the documentation says that it can help you figure out if your setup is transparent, but it can be also used to figure out what the audio signature in terms of equalization or transformation from the sound you are getting. Like if you get an open source CAN converter and you plug it and record through that, does it affect? Well, you can check that, because you run your base recording without the hardware, then you run it with the open source CAN converter and compare those. And if they are identical, then there's no noise that the open source can convert is getting into it, and that's the case. The OSSC is completely transparent, and it can also be used like for comparing cables, audio cables, video cables. If there's noise from the video signal and how much, it measures the noise floor, and can help you compare. Just like Chris said, the VHAs, what is it doing to the sound, right? But in terms of like a speaker, you'd need to have a calibrated microphone and a good setup to record that to know what's really going on, and that you're not comparing what the microphone does to the recording, right?
Well, and related to that, the other night the four of us were chatting, and I kind of brought up how I was not a huge arcade kid, and of course when I was in the arcade, it was usually very noisy, and I had a hard time hearing like the sounds of a specific game. So I don't have like a solid idea. I don't collect arcade boards. I don't have a super gun except for my Neo Geo. Um, so I don't have that solid of an idea of like what do arcade games sound like outside of emulators. And I was emulating some arcade games in the past several weeks to record them, and I was just like, you know I don't like how arcade games sound. Is this how they really sound? And you were telling me, no, I mean, this is actually a big problem where I don't think very many arcade games actually take into account the very particular types of speakers that the machines actually had. And that's why these emulated arcade games often sound very kind of shrill.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
they're just blown out kind of at times.
You have I probably think you have the answer to that, Chris.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, in addition to, if you think about the sound that these systems have, in addition to the chip, you have the preamplifier and all the capacitors that are involved. But then you do have the speaker that's in the cabinet, and then you have the cabinet itself. Because whenever you listen to something and you have your headphones on, or you're listening to your hi-fi system or whatever, that speaker enclosure itself is affecting what it sounds like. And so when you have this large MDF or particle board or what have you enclosure that the sound is coming from, that's also going to affect what you hear, and therefore affect your memories of that particular arcade game. So if you were to load it up in something like MAME, and they just happen to not be doing filters for those particular sound chips and that output, as well as some sort of equalization, if you prefer, to simulate it being in an arcade cabinet, then yeah, it's not going to sound anything like it. And in fact, I even think for Capcom, for CPS1, we have Street Fighter, the original Street Fighter, Chun-Li is actually voiced by 3 different women, I think. So each one that says, like, one says Yata and someone else says spinning bird kick, and it's all different. But they knew that because the fidelity would not be as high when they played it back, then it was okay to have different people voicing. But then when they moved to CPS2, the sound increased in quality, and they said, well, now we're going to have to redo the voices so it's more consistent.
That's why they gave
That's
everybody
funny.
their own voices, starting with Super, I think, probably, because they had to redo everything.
Yeah.
Well, but it's interesting thinking about, the arcade, and, obviously you want to preserve the actual unfiltered sound that is truly coming from the arcade board.
Yeah,
But it would be really interesting to be able to somehow have the option to kind of replicate that for a standard like home theater setup.
the thing is, now that you mention it, for instance, MAME's objective is not to preserve whatever is outside the arcade board, right? Its objective is to preserve what's inside the arcade board, and it doesn't go to the filters or to the simulation of the equipment that you're using. But one rationale behind that is that if you plug it, MAME, straight into a preamplifier and then to an arcade speaker, you'll have to simulate it by a physical means. And we're talking about simulating via virtual means, right? And that's good. It would be good to have an option, but it's one main target and very important target is to have it reproduce the sound exactly as the original hardware did. So you could have that output stage connected to anything physical and not being altered as if it were completely exchangeable. I mean, if you have a Sega Genesis and have a Mister, you can swap them and you wouldn't notice the difference if they are if they are targeting the same system and the same filters. Then the idea is that you wouldn't notice it, right?
Yeah.
And
But
if you
then I
have,
guess
yeah,
the result is more and more people play, you know, as time goes on, and
yeah,
there's fewer and fewer people that actually experience these games in their intended environment. People think, well, this is just how these games sounded. You know, you've got all of these arcade, you know, officially released arcade collections and stuff, and people just think this is how they sounded, and it's not true. So, you know, it is really a tricky matter.
yes, because the user needs to understand that as a requirement from their side. Like, I need it to be pure because I am going to connect it or plug it into an arcade cabinet, or I am going to just like have it unfiltered or filtered because my home theater is a very high fidelity system. I want to have the emulation or simulation cut all those high end or high spectrum frequencies, like all the treble, because the arcade cabinets use like speakers that were up to 8 kilohertz or 10 kilohertz, and that gives it a filter, a very steep filter that removes all the harshness that Yamaha synthesis by FM, just like the Genesis, the preamplifier does that as well, and that is sometimes not preserved, right? And we want to have those as options and teach the user which one would be ideal for their situation, and that's not something easy, right?
Yeah. And for some systems, that's very subjective. Like the IBM PC in particular,
Yeah.
there are hundreds of sound cards for that thing, and they all have different circuits, right? So, like,
Yep.
if I said Doom, how are you going to preserve Doom? You know, which sound card are you going to select? Because if you select a Sound Blaster 16, it doesn't have the same low pass filter as the Sound Blaster Pro. So whenever you fire the machine gun and you hear da 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 with a Sound Blaster 16, when you fire it on the Pro, you're going to hear more of like a it's going to be this much more like muffled sound. It's totally different, but you got to preserve both.
Yeah.
And that's aware of it.
And I think
on top of that,
sorry,
Corey, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and when it comes down to that, it almost seems like insurmountable at this point. Like there's just too much out there that I think that, you know, like what is preventing from people just being like, there's no way we can do this. So
Well, especially with like arcade stuff in particular. I mean, you know, every individual game, I mean, you would have to come up with a way to run MD48 style tests on each board. You know, when it comes to Sega Genesis or NES or something like that. Well, NES is kind of a complicated matter itself, and maybe that's another topic we want to talk about because of expansion audio. You know, you cannot preserve the sound of expansion audio or get a profile test of the expansion audio without having those actual cartridges that have the expansion audio hardware. You can't run that test on an emulated form without having results from the real thing. And you know, how are you going to run that test on hardware that wasn't designed to run it? So you know, that's obviously, that's not something that just anyone can do. You know, that's obviously something someone who can, you know, wire into, you know, these boards very carefully, as opposed to, you know, I can just use my Mega EverDrive and run MD4A on my Sega Genesis, or you know, use my Super SD System 3 to run it on, you know, provided that has accurate sound output. I can run that through, you know, on my PC Engine. But you know, with very specialized thing where the sound comes from specialty hardware that is part of the board, like a Famicom cartridge or an arcade game, like that's just a huge task that is going to be something that only a limited few people can actually do.
Yeah, you'll have to jump into Z80 assembly and Motorola 68K assembly, right? Arcade homebrew.
I mean,
You could test it on an emulator, burn it on a ROM, and then jam it into the socket of your CPS2 board, and then say, "All right, let's run MD4A."
And I think that
And-
by
and
putting it
that's a
out there
target.
and making it open source, getting people interested in it, Artemio, I think you told me one time that that's kind of a problem that like MAME is running into, where they're running out of people who are knowledgeable and really feel the drive to preserve this stuff. And CRT is in the same way. We're just like the people that really understand this stuff, are eventually going to die, and this information needs to be passed on.
And there needs to be interests from the generation that's younger, right? It's not that it's not happening. There's very talented individuals that are younger and that get into this and do amazing work and have helped in every sense. But yes, most of this old school knowledge is for people that's older than myself, and that's that's a shame, right?
Mhm.
So do we want to take a look at some of the discoveries that you've made? Do you have some examples available?
Oh, I have a few things that we could show.
Yeah.
Let me. This is, for instance, the plot between a Model 1 and a Model 2 Sega Genesis system. And what you're seeing on screen is from left to right, the x-axis is frequencies. To the left, you have what we call the low end, or what's called the low end. It's frequencies closer to zero, and that's the bass, right? Like your bass guitar. And to the right, you have the treble, and that's the high end. Okay, as you go from left to right, you go from very low frequencies to high frequencies, bass to treble. Okay, the middle line is a zero. What you're seeing here is a difference plot. It's the difference between two spectrograms. It's the difference between how what Genesis sounds against the other. So if this plot, this graph, were to be completely empty, it would be a perfect match. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
If it would be a straight line in the middle around zero, it would be also a very, very close to perfect match, because it would tell you that everything is in the same spot. Okay? What you're seeing here is some differences. And those differences go up and below. That means that we are comparing against the reference system. The reference here is the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis Model 1. And the comparison system is a Model 2. So what you're seeing is how much the Model 2 differs against the Model 1. Okay? And all you're seeing on screen is how it differs. So you can tell that there are three colors. You have green, yellow, and teal, aqua color. Okay, a bluish one. The green one is FM. That's the Yamaha synth. The yellow and blue one or teal one are the SPSG, the other synth from the Sega Master System that's in there. And the traces show you how the audio differs in volumes or amplitudes between them. So you can tell that on a Model 2, the FM is higher in volume against the PSG, and that they are also filtered in a different way. They have different curves that tell you how they are equalized. And if you flatten those, if you were to create a filter to flatten those, you'll get a flat line and you'd get the same sound. That's what the triple bypass, for example, does. If you insert a triple bypass into one Genesis 2, it shatters or simply squashes those to be the same as a Model 1 BA3. Okay, that's kind of of what you're seeing here. I don't know if you've got any questions about this.
No, not about that in particular, but I mean, the interesting thing about how you can see like what the levels produced by the different chips. I don't know if you have any examples on hand that were compared against an emulator, whether that's a FPGA emulator or a software emulator, but like for example, when I was working on the episode for the NT Mini Noir and I, wanted to run MD Fourier tests on it, I was able to very clearly see, square one, square two, triangle wave, noise channels, stuff like that. I could see these clear lines and I could see how far off center they were. And that gave me an idea of, okay, I could use, if I remember right, I think I was using like the triangle wave was very close to the middle, very close to zero. The others need to come down a bit though. So, this is something that not just someone who is engineering a new emulator or some sort of preservation tools can use. If you just want to tune your own emulation device that you own, you can use it to get much closer to the target that you're looking for. Like getting as close as possible to a real NES. Now, the NT Mini Noir cannot get 100% there. There is a low pass filter on it that you can't do anything about, but you can get it much closer than the defaults on the firmware. So it's something that anyone might want to consider doing when you do have that power to change the levels of various sound channels.
Other things that are really cool about the MD4A project is you can compare cable quality. So different RGB cable manufacturers, you can look and see what sort of noise level you're getting from generally a video signal interfering with audio.
This is a comparison between two cables, for example.
And I think it's important to remember that if you record MD4A from a console via analog output and then record MD4A again from that same console, there are going to be differences just because of the inherent noise in analog cables. So there is a certain range where you can expect some differences are normal just because of the nature of analog.
And wasn't it recently discovered? You guys told me about this during our talk a couple of days ago that the SNES sounds different as it warms up.
Yeah.
Which is incredible. Is crazy to me.
Not in the way that I think ears can percept, but
MD4A can.
But MD4A can.
Yeah, here is a graph that shows you how the frequency changes between the same Super Nintendo as I turn it on and let it heat to room temperature, and then artificially heat it and artificially cool it down. Okay. And as it was heated up and it was cooled down artificially, you'd get a difference in pitch. And this is not only between a single Super Nintendo system. Every Super Nintendo system has a clock, let's say, just that changes with the temperature and between make. So no Super Nintendo sounds exactly the same at the exact same temperature, and it doesn't sound like itself at different temperatures. And we're not talking like a huge difference. We're talking like in music, you measure this in cents. That's 100th of the frequency between one note in an octave and the next one. And there's people that can notice this kind of difference with their bare ears. But the MD4A can tell us this and how they differ in tonality.
And what's so funny is y'all were talking about how the actual on paper specs of the Super Nintendo, like it wouldn't actually hit those unless you were artificially cooling the system to be like 0 degrees Celsius or something.
Yeah, it never runs at the specified clock speed. It always runs a little higher.
And, I do think Super Nintendo is an interesting example because I think Super Nintendo, most people don't think Super Nintendo tends to be emulated subjectively pretty well in terms of sound, especially. Like, generally when you play it on a software emulator, you play it on a Super NT or a Mister, you're like, yeah, that sounds like a Super Nintendo. But you found a lot more differences even with that system than you expected.
Yeah, there were a lot of differences. David from Plogue, David Biens, made an excellent test. This is the test that I'm showing on the screen. Is the basic test that I made like a year ago, and David made an amazing test for the Super Nintendo. That's like a stress test and goes through all the places that it needs to go because he uses the SPU directly instead of just like playing samples as I did. But that's the answer to why try, because it runs samples, and they are kind of more direct because you have already a digital sound that you know how to play and at which frequency. However, what I'm showing on screen is the curve that the low pass filter in a Super Nintendo has. So it does filter the sound, and that's generally not targeted as a part of the emulation. How the higher frequencies are
Mm.
diminished in a real Super Nintendo system, as opposed to an emulator or even Toslink out, to reduce the harshness of the high frequencies, either intentionally or not. But it was there, right?
Hmm.
We also have, Artemio, you have some data about the capacitors in the Turbo Duo.
Yes. Here
Yes.
it
I
is.
mean, what was that your personal system?
Yeah, this one that's on screen right now, it's one of my personal systems. It's a PC Engine Duo, that they are notable for their failing capacitors, and you can see that it's all over the place, right?
Hmm.
And it's the same system against itself. And what this plot shows is how much each one of the audio channels differ when you change capacitors, because this was recorded after I recapped the system and before. And
That's
what?
crazy.
Yeah,
Same
it is.
different capacitors, that much of a difference.
And for example, your childhood Sega Genesis Model 1 that everyone who's used MD4A to try to match like Mr. cores and stuff to it is stock. You've never
No.
modified it in any way whatsoever. Now, we assume that capacitors are not altering the audio signal, but we actually don't necessarily know.
Well, we kind of know because we have used it interchangeably due to several reasons. One of them being that Bob from Retro RGB, Bernard, and Tianfeng, and David have measured their own systems,
Mhm.
and they measure basically 99.95% similar to mine. So
Okay.
we can say that either all Sega Genesis aged the same way
Hmm.
under very different conditions, or that it hasn't been changed that much. And we have also checked that against recapped systems, and the signature, unless they were damaged, has not changed. My particular system does have an inconvenience. While I was developing MD4E, I noticed during summer that sometimes I would get different readings from my same Sega Genesis system.
Just during the
And you know
summer.
what was it? It was because my room was like at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and one of the capacitors is not very good. And with the combined temperature inside the Sega Genesis after 1 or 2 hours of being on, it changes the volume of one of the channels. But that's something that you
No,
can check.
I mean, I've seen something like that happen with mine, where my like the right channel on mine is just like very, very slightly lower than the left channel.
Yeah, and that's the idea that you can just like check your system, record it before sending it for service,
Hmm.
recording it after sending it for service, and
Mhm.
check if it changed. That would
Yeah.
be one use case. Another use case could be, okay, I record my Sega Genesis, check it against the reference that we have verified, and you'd have to trust us, but we are putting everything out that we have, and you see that it differs. Then you can tell, okay, there's something bad on my right channel on the mixing between the PSG and FM. Okay, and you can go and just like check that. That's what Tianfeng has done a lot of the times, and that's part of the other use. And in that capacitor measurement that I showed, I also show that the CD-ROM access time changed because I can measure that, and it changed after recapping the system. It changed the volume between ADPCM and PSG and the CD-ROM and how the frequencies went. So it was completely off. Okay.
Artemio, do you
So
want to share which systems the MD4A is currently under development for?
Yeah, sure. It's been published to the public for Genesis, Sega CD, PC Engine, and PC Engine CD. It's already done but not published for the basic NES system, but we need to make expansion audio. Pinobatch has done an amazing job at making those designing those tests. We have also unpublished audio equipment test that's for general audio equipment checking. We have Super Nintendo that David Beans made and is amazing. And I have to just like match it with my old test to get the whole thing because MD4 not only measures audio, it also measures frame rate and another video parameters, and I want to match that before releasing Super Nintendo. And it's also a, a big can of worms. It's being developed for Neo Geo. It's probably been well, it's being developed right now for CPS one, but it's a very early stage, and we also have some working prototypes for Commodore 64, but that's very deep waters to go into.
Oh gosh, the SID chip, that'd be
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
You
David
know,
has
I
a
have
lot of.
I have a question that I've actually kind of wondered about for a while, you know, regarding like Sega CD and TurboGrafx CD. You know, I think normally we think of, and you know, I have to confess to not being all that familiar with the Sega CD personally. I think we normally think of, you know, Sega CD is mixing audio from the Sega Genesis with streamed audio from the Sega CD. When you know, we know that flash cartridges like Mega SD and Mega Everdrive Pro have used um MD4A to some extent to you know, attempt to hit more accurate targets. Um, but is it just about balancing the volume of the streamed audio with the console audio, or is there more to the characteristics of those CD audio systems that I'm kind of just not thinking about?
There's more detail, like how do they do fade out, for example. That was an issue that showed in one of those cards,
Mm.
and you have to mimic that, right? Because otherwise it won't work. How they sync the audio when you're playing it back, and how they respond to the commands, because it's like a different part of the system. And of course, you also have the filtering, not also the balance, but the filtering. In terms of CD audio, you expect them to be non-different in frequency information as FM or
Mhm.
PSG or samples are, but they could differ, and that would mean that there's some processing being done aside from uh, the frequency response or the equalization. You also have aliasing that could be done or present due to filtering or conversion between sample rates, and that's a huge issue that Risha addressed for Mister with Sentinel 6 and Sultan. They made amazing work on that, and they also implemented filters that could be system wide for Mister. And resampling is an issue that brings up aliasing, which brings up a lot of artifacts on sound and CD sound, because CD sound runs at 44 kilohertz, and you usually emulate at 48 kilohertz, and you have to find a multiple of that to work towards the higher end and then go back to whatever the user is outputting, and that is difficult.
You know, I don't know why, but you know, just talking about these CD systems kind of made me just think, and you know, this is beyond MD4A, right? At least at the moment. But you know, there's the whole thing about the PlayStation One with the, you know, the RCA jack units. You know, everyone talks about, ooh, it
That's
had
been
the
measured. That's been
it
measured.
had it has been, and I heard something not that long ago that is it totally placebo? Is that not even true, or is there something to it?
Well, you could use MD4 right now and use the audio equipment test and play just a CD version of
Okay.
that test and check out by yourself if that is true or it is.
Hmm. I thought that tests not using the actual MD4A uh, sound playback from like the 240p test suite, you know, using those actual doop, 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 doop
Yeah.
sounds. I thought, you know, I've asked you about in the past, like, oh, could I just record two versions of the same music? And I was under the impression that was, in theory, you could do it, but was not officially like sanctioned yet.
Yeah, no, it's not officially supported, and it's in there, but it's not. It won't ever be public because the precision of the MP4 is it's very dependent on syncing the signals and having a very precise alignment between the audio signals. But the audio equipment test runs on any audio playback system. If
I
you have
see.
a way to play a FLAC or a WAV file, then you can measure that equipment. And that way is the way I was proposing. You could check because you burn a CD with an audio track that's specifically designed for testing audio at 44 kilohertz,
Oh, okay.
and that we have, and then you just compare that the original the digital image that we have against your recording, and you'll get the differences that PlayStation makes on that audio file as a CD player, because there's more work to do against the XA audio, the synthesizer, everything inside a PlayStation. But yeah, that's within the scope of what we plan to do. But although a friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, is working on that, it's way into the future. It's a lot of work, a lot of work. Any help is of course welcome. This is not like gatekeeping, just like you said.
Do you have a call for any developers in particular to develop in a certain assembly language or C or what have you for a specific machine? A lot of Japanese PCs, for instance.
Anybody who has interest in there is pretty welcome. We need any help that you could share. David is very capable of doing a lot of stuff. Binobatch is awesome at developing many of these things, but we need more help. We need to develop for the Sega Master System. We need to develop for every arcade board out there. So C80 is a pretty big target. As you can see, this is a program in the C80 CPU book, and that's what I'm trying to get into near Geo, and that would open against what another friend is making for CPS1, and try to help us out and work our way to have this running on everywhere as much system as possible. I'd love to have it in X68000, PC88, PCFX, N64, and there's a lot of stuff. Also running on Dreamcast or GameCube. Those are targets that the 240p test suite already has, but there's the issue of frame buffers, syncing, a lot of things that need to be figured out because I'm not an expert. I'm learning as I go. David from Plug has been an amazing guide, as well as Pinovac and Tianfeng and Bob from RetroRGB and Bernard to guide me through what is going on and what I'm doing, because this project was built around just a requirement that we had together with My Life in Gaming about analyzing a system audio, and I had coded a tool to assist me at home whenever somebody rang the bell. I wanted it to be notified to my phone, so I used a Raspberry Pi, making a Fourier transform every 5 seconds, and recognize that sound and send me a signal to my phone whenever that happened. And I had that in my desktop and already made, and we wanted to analyze sound. I just put 2 and 2 together and made it, right? But so I'm just learning as I go.
Where should people go to find out more about the MD4A project?
Right now, the junkerhq.net has a site, a mini site that has MD4A with all the documentation, and you can contact me by any of the means available there. And if you want to go into the development, there's a Discord for it, where we develop this, right? Or it's pretty open in general.
All right. Do you guys have anything else to add, chat? Do you have any questions for us? We're a little over now, but
Yeah, I see a couple of people said they already had to head on out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not seeing anything
So
else.
it sounds like the people who came in late, apparently this is a problem they had all day, where the people who came in late, for some reason the video wouldn't load, but the videos are going to be available on demand through the duration of the uplink event. I believe is what I saw the organizers posting in the chat.
all right. Well, I guess we'll officially sign off. So thanks everyone for coming to the panel talking about sound. Thank you guys for joining me, and see you around the net.
Thanks everybody
Thank
for checking us out, and thanks for
Enjoy
having
the
us.
rest of Uplink.
Thanks for having us on the panel, Chris. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Certainly, anytime.
All right, take care, everybody.